And what I will do is I will, as I said, I will share the screen. When I'm sharing the screen, I will not be able to see your questions. Yeah. So just so you know, you can write questions in the chat box, and once we end with the part that's where I'm talking more, I'll be able to have a look at the chat box, and then we'll be able to have questions perhaps that you may have that you want to discuss, and you'll be able to raise your hand, and I'll mute you, and then we'll have a conversation, and others will be able to hear. So we have a time. It's from it's now 8:08. We have time until 9:30. That's the maximum amount of time that we have. Obviously, I have not prepared to talk for until 9:30 because I want to be able to give time for questions and discussion. So, so that's roughly the format that we will follow. So you're very welcome to write those questions in the chat. Just remember, while I'm sharing screen, I cannot see your questions in the chat box, but I will, I will discuss them afterwards. So I hope that's okay. I hope that's acceptable. So I apologize again for muting you, but I do it in love because otherwise I just won't be able to give anything over to you that I think will be coherent, and it's important for me that what I offer you is coherent. Okay, so with that, let me just share a portion of my screen, and you hopefully should see in a second something that will make sense. Let's see. Now, can somebody just nod their head and tell me that they are seeing the screen, hopefully? Yes, somebody's, okay. And can you hear me? Yeah, yes, okay, great. Thank you very much for those who are nodding their head, very helpful. Okay, so I'm gonna start with introductions. I know some of you know me, so I apologize for those who do know me. I don't apologize, but I want to take the time to make sure that everybody who is here tonight knows who I am and a little bit about me, because I think all of these sort of conversations about human emotions, about the kinds of process that we're all going through, is I think it very much speaks to our personal lives and who we are as people. So let me just see why. Okay, so you should be seeing the next slide. I hope that's okay. So who I am professionally, I am a psychotherapist, licensed psychotherapist in the state of New York. I'm a member of British Association for Counseling and Psychotherapy. I'm a teaching member and a supervisor for Israeli Association of Sound Play Therapy, British and Irish Association for Sound Play Therapy, and that feeds into an international organization for sound play therapy. So it's a lot of names about sound play therapy, but it just tells you a little bit about. It will make sense in a second, I think, once I say a little bit about myself. I am a supervisor, proof supervisor of Play Therapy International, so I supervise play therapists and other psychotherapists. And I am a certified clinical trauma specialist. I have worked with trauma as well as loss of bereavement for quite a few years, and for around 18 years. But looking at these places, perhaps you had been wondering why I am, what that might suggest about myself. So I will share with you that I'm, and you will see that this parallels a little bit my life story. I was born in Ukraine. My parents moved to the United States when I was a teenager, and from there, where I lived and studied, and then I lived in France and England, and now I live in Israel. So in some ways, my professional journey very much is intertwined with my personal journey, and what those experiences were for me. So the areas of my specialty are loss and bereavement, which is something that very much links with, I think, today's topic, trauma and trauma-informed therapy, immigration, integration, and identity. This is an area that I think I found very interesting historically. People who were living somewhere where it was not the country of their birth had found a way to work with me. Many years of experience of working with children and families. And last but not least, it's an area of my work that I value enormously and appreciate very much, and I know it's of a lot of help to people, is Jungian sound play therapy, which would probably that would have to be a webinar on its own to talk about what that is. I also work in English, French, and Russian, as you will see. This also reflects my life story. So one might say, and so I'm just trying to move on to the next slide. Sometimes it takes a second for it to decide to go. Yeah. So one might say, why grief? Why we're talking about grief and why now? There's a lot to talk about all the time about all kinds of different things. But I feel very compelled to talk about grief, and especially now. And I'll tell you a little bit about why that is. Since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, it's become pretty obvious to me in that that there is something around grief, there's something about loss that people, my clients, my friends and family are experiencing, and sometimes it's been very difficult to name those feelings and to name that process. And what I've also discovered, both through my own journey during this time, but also again noticing what my clients were working through and my friends and family were living through, is that I noticed that what I was seeing began to resemble the stages of grief that we already know about. When we talk about grief, usually when we talk about loss and grief, we tend to refer to what we know happens to people when they lost a loved one or somebody who is close to them through a physical death. And it just feels to me sometimes we're not that at this time for many reasons, I'm sure we're not talking enough about grief. We're not naming it, and we're perhaps not paying enough attention to not only to the challenges of it, but also of these enormous opportunities. Because I really do believe that this time now and the emotional process that we're living through now is enormous. It's a huge opportunity for awareness, for growth, for change, for for all of these things. And so it feels really important to me to be able to talk to you today about that. In many ways, if you think about it, loss and grief is part of our lives anyway, in greater or lesser forms. So if we obviously the actual death or physical death, I guess that probably makes more sense when we talk about that. But every life stage is connected to loss in some way, even if it's what we're going towards is something very positive. It could be graduation, or it could be immigration, it could be a birth of a child. All of these things have enormous positive element to it, but often if one pays attention enough, there's a sense of loss, and there's a sense of every change in itself has a bit of loss. Obviously that varies from person to person to what extent that's the case, but sometimes paying attention to those feelings can really enhance how we live through those moments and what we take from these moments. So it's not just a conversation about the theoretical concepts, but I really believe that when we pay attention to these feelings, then we move through this process in a much more meaningful way, and a way that we can take much more from. So I'll just want to mention, a couple of things that I think perhaps are a little bit maybe less relevant for some of us in terms of where we are with coronavirus pandemic. So I'm just trying to get my slide to work, and for some reason it's lower than usual. So I just will say a couple of things about it. I don't want us to spend too much time on it because we're not really at the beginning anymore. But I think some of the things to experience at the beginning might be useful just to remember. And so some of the what seemed to have kind of what I've noticed more acutely, I should say, from the beginning, or at the beginning, was that sense of fear in people, the fear of the unknown, the virus and the pandemic, and all of these things that were happening very, very, very much unknown, of illness itself, is that being illness itself can be quite scary, and it can evoke a lot of feelings, but also actually becoming sick. And I know that may sound like that's the same thing, but if you really think about it, they actually could different things. Being abstractly kind of afraid of an illness, there's an abstract sort of idea, an abstract entity. And then there's also fear of becoming ill. I've observed, again, a lot of anxiety. I suppose that these are fear and anxiety, often bedfellows. They're often, connected to one another. Anxiety, tension, and I think that for people who perhaps didn't feel so much fear and anxiety, it was more expressed as tension. It's almost like it's hard to really relax. It's hard to really feel at ease somehow. Sense of panic. for some people. I'm sure you remember those, and what was remarkable about it is you've seen it in all different countries, of this tendency to overbuy or hoard food and various items, which, if one looks at it rationally, one could see that it probably was unnecessary. But there was that sense for so many people, that of panic, of fear, of panic, of not having enough. And also, I think for some people, it was a sense of disbelief. It was almost as if, how could this be happening? What is happening, actually? And so it was very hard to sort of almost connect to this idea. So I think as the pandemic progressed, and I guess we're not really done with it anyway, but I suppose in those acute stages, what I feel were really acute stages, because I think now we're in a different relationship to what's going on than we were, let's say, before. Was that sense of loss of social connections, because all of a sudden we realized we weren't able to be socialized like we used to do before. And for many of us, this is the first time that was ever even a situation that you couldn't, do that. In some ways, that kind of led to that sense of loss of life that we knew before, of just casually getting together, of blowing candles on a birthday cake, of just being able to go about life without sort of thinking about so many things. Not knowing what life after the quarantine or the lockdowns, wherever it's called different things in different countries, I think, look like. For many people who don't live near their families, they're not being able to see them all of a sudden as casually as we did before, was, I think, quite a shock. Of course, as people began getting ill, there was now feelings and realizations that death are starting to happen. For people who have lost somebody, who began to lose loved ones, this was a very, very concrete and real loss. And for other people, for whom these people who were dying were not their friends and family, still the feeling, the issues of bereavement, the feeling of loss and bereavement began to emerge, because you couldn't ignore them anymore. They were happening. They just perhaps weren't happening to those who you were close to. But they began to happen. And so I think something began to really change in the collective, which I'll say a bit more about, because I think that's I feel a unique feature of this pandemic. It is not only the changes, not only how it affected us personally, but also how it affected us as a collective. And that sense of loneliness, a lot of people who had began to really feel a sense of loneliness, a sense of lack of connection to others, which is, I suppose, fits into what I said before. So this were kind of what I've noticed, and what I felt important to highlight, the beginning kind of stages of this, our collective and individual coping with this pandemic. Just one second. I'm sorry, take a second for some reason the slides to move through. Now, I want to just now really begin to really think together with you about specifically the grieving process with coronavirus. And I think the first few slides I wanted to show you, I wanted to kind of set the foundation for it. But when loss and death are concrete, so I'm sure, we have here, I think, people from different countries and different cultures and different religions. So, I'm hoping as you're listening to this, you're thinking about some of those things as they pertain to you. That, different cultures and religions, we have different rituals for how we deal with loss and bereavement and loss and death. So, but they're often quite specific to an actual physical death. Usually that's specific to someone passing away quite concretely. But when we're talking about coronavirus and the grieving of the corona, as I see happening in this for all of us in one way or the other, it's very hard to relate to these rituals when the loss is not necessarily physical. So there's something very unique about this grieving process for those people who haven't actually lost a loved one or somebody that they're close to. And what I've noticed in my clinical work, and also, as I say, in myself and people around me, is this kind of range of feelings of uneasiness, a sense of heaviness, a sense of preoccupation, sometimes tearfulness, difficulty sleeping, difficulties relaxing, that were kind of diffused. It was very difficult almost sometimes to connect it to something. So I think that, but as time went on, what I've noticed is that the feelings that people were reporting and began to move through begin to resemble the stages of loss of grief that we know happens when people lose somebody to death. And so I want to share them with you. Maybe some of you may know them from your previous experience of reading, or if you're a therapist, you probably have heard about them. These are 5 stages of grief and loss, has originally been written about by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her colleagues. I want to say before I go on to talk about it, it's not meant to be seen as a prescription, that they follow in a concrete stage, that it's always like this, it's always linear, it's always correct, and it really isn't like that. People move through different stages and different feelings, and then they come back to them as something comes up, or they're triggered into having feelings about what they've lived through. So it's not prescriptive, but it does seem to be that they often, not always, but often they tend to speak to certain processes or certain experiences or certain flow, maybe that's the best word, sort of flow of kind of consciousness or flow of emotional life. And as we're talking about, I want you to think about that as, in relation to what's going on for all of us in respect of a coronavirus. So the first stage, or first kind of place often that people find themselves in, is that often, not always, but often, is denial. That feeling of disbelief. How could this happen? It's shock sometimes. It may look like shock. And I found that in our situation with coronavirus, this stage was even more pronounced than usual, because the virus is invisible. It's not something very specific or concrete that you can see with your own eyes. And so I think for some people, it was really difficult to even kind of begin to understand what's going on. And I think that's kind of gone on for quite some time. And I think also it's very interesting because our situation with the virus is such as that it's infectious. And so I've noticed that there was quite a lot of feelings on the part of people who felt that they were beginning to understand what was going on and were not in denial anymore towards those that they perceived as being in denial. And all these kind of moral and ethical considerations around that. If I don't take precautions, what does that mean for somebody else? What does that mean to somebody else who might be more vulnerable? And so that took us kind of very interestingly straight into our individual reactions, our individual experiences, our individual ways in which we dealt with everything, or dealt with the beginning, but also how are we as a collective, how we as a groups of people are responding to what's going on, which I think is quite unique, because you don't always find that if a loved one passes away, it's usually, it generally tends to be more individual or family based. So the next sort of emotion that seems to be prevalent, or seems to have been prevalent, is that feeling of anger. And perhaps that was not always as visible as other feelings, because anger often makes us feel uncomfortable. It's often a feeling that we don't like to share with others. It's a feeling that, it's uncomfortable. You're not supposed to feel that, and you're not supposed to feel that often in public, or at least that's what people believe. Even though it's quite common. It can be sometimes directed at others. It can sometimes be directed at the government. It could be directed at your neighbors who are not, from one's perspective, is not kind of following government's requirements around how to protect all of us. But nevertheless, it seemed like there was a lot of anger that began to kind of seep out for people. And I think what's really important is that when there is anger, very often there's something behind anger, and there's often pain or other feelings. And so when we see people having feelings of anger, especially in this situation, we must ask ourselves to what extent, what else we're feeling behind that or connected to it. So the next sort of stage or place or station in this kind of if we can describe this journey as a flow in some ways, is what's called bargaining. It's this sort of feeling of wanting so badly to return to how things were. When it's physical death, it's often, wanting so much to have this person back in our lives. When it's a loss or death, so much wanting. It's almost like bargaining with life, bargaining with yourself, bargaining with God, bargaining with higher power. But however that that may seem to you, however you understand that. But it's almost like, if I did this, if I could have done that, or if I should have thought of that, or if only, what if I have done that? Could I have thought of this? It's almost like you're negotiating. It's if only, if only, if only. Um, and that I sort of from my experience I've noticed that less. But nevertheless, it has come. I have seen that come up also, like for my clients, also for people that are close to me. And it's almost like we're negotiating with our own sadness, or we're negotiating with our own disappointment or pain, or it's almost like it's difficult. It seems to be so connected to with difficulties accepting that that's where we are, and we are where we are, and we might not like where we are. And in the case of coronavirus, it felt like we don't really even know so much about where we are, because which some directives we get one day get contradicted another day, and there's something very wonderful about all this information, the access information we have. But at the same time, because of all this access information that we do have, it can be very overwhelming. It can be very contradictory sometimes, and it doesn't always add to a whole lot of clarity. So I've often heard people say, well, if only we just find this vaccine, we'll find the vaccine and it'll be okay, or we'll the treatment will be found. If only treatment will be found, it'll be fine. We'll go back to how things used to be. Now the next stage, and the next sort of place I'd like to pause for a moment, because I think this is really a place where people probably have a lot of feelings about, where a lot of people experience a lot of feelings, and probably a very, very, very important place to really think together about is what's called depression. And it doesn't mean necessarily the diagnostic clinical depression. I'm not talking about depression per se necessarily, but I think this is a stage where it's probably one of the deepest levels of grief, because somehow at this point people usually we arrive at some sense of reality that whatever is going on has changed our reality, and the reality we're facing now is not what it used to be. Again, when it's a physical death, that probably is quite self-explanatory in terms of that sort of impression or feeling. But with coronavirus pandemic, it just because it's so diffused in many ways, and because it's almost invisible somehow, unless you are one of the people who have lost somebody to the illness. And this is a place where really facing feelings as in terms of reaction, real emotional reaction, becomes much more acute. And I think this is really where denial, I feel, is now less, is working less, and less prevalent. And so, if we're thinking of grief as a process of healing, as a process of moving through grief, as a process of healing, the process of coming to terms with a loss, then this stage, I think, is is one of the key stages. It's not the only stage, but that's key. But I think it's one of the really, really key stages, particularly because the denial and that earlier disbelief that I still feel plays a big part in at the beginning seems to have waned to some degree. Some people who have experienced depression before, it can indeed be a trigger for feeling depressed again. It's not always, but that can be. And sometimes depression can look like absence. You know, it's not something I want to say because sometimes people think there's a certain image we have of what a person looks like when they're depressed. But sometimes it looks like an absence. Yeah. And sometimes it can be very cathartic. And I certainly can speak from my experience of having been ill during that period of time. You know, having to face that ill, having to face being ill, and I still don't know whether I was ill with coronavirus or not, but having to face feeling ill and having to face that was very sobering, and in many ways was very cathartic in terms of forcing me to look at what was coming up for me. So it doesn't mean that you have to be ill for that to happen, but I think there is a real potential here of touching one's own depth of emotion, which can be very healing and can be very cathartic, and it really can help sometimes move through something very, very painful that perhaps has been sitting inside of us for some time. So the next point I want to talk about, just to say something about, is the fifth stage of grief. Roughly saying, as I said, it's not a fixed diagram. It's not meant to be used as fixed diagram. Is acceptance, or some degree of acceptance, I should say, because it's not a fixed thing. Acceptance of new reality is not going to be fixed in this particular moment in time. We'll come back to it, we revisit it, we move through some of the feelings that I've already discussed. But I think that when we reach that point of at least partial acceptance of the new reality, I think it allows us a different degree of integration. And I think, again, when we have concrete death, that's sort of a little bit more straightforward, although it's still very painful. And the feelings of sadness are there sometimes, feelings of loss are there, feelings of pain are there, feelings of missing someone are there. But in our case with coronavirus, for those, again, who I'm speaking specifically for those aspects that are not related to physical death, it's almost like this acceptance of the fact that we don't know what the new reality will be when we are maybe out of the quarantine, or we're out of lockdown, or we're out of quarantine into a partial quarantine, or we don't know what it would look like. We don't know there will be another wave of coronavirus, which is what often the experts and so on and government officials talk about. Will there not be? Will we have to wear masks? Will we not have to wear masks? When we go, can we resume? What parts of our life can we resume? How would this look like? So again, it sort of brings up a lot of anxiety and a lot of sort of unknown, and how do we live? I think this is a really key question, is how do we deal with unknown, and to what extent, what can we rely upon inside of ourselves when there's so much that's unknown? And so what I want to say about a quarantine and this isolation that I'd like to spend us a little bit more time thinking about together, is that it seems to have, for a lot of people, is that it seems to have amplified what was going well for them in their life, what they were happy with, and that was not going well at all. So the choice was either to have a look at that and try to think about that and find a way of understanding that and relating to that, and perhaps maybe some cases making changes or not. Some of my clients have talked about some relationships or friendships or social connections that have almost like disappeared, and some other ones have really come to life and have really become so much more meaningful. And so, as one of my friends says, you can either choose to lean into something or not, and it's not always a choice. It's very easy to say to choose, so it's not always very easy to do that. But I think there is something there about, I think what she's speaking about is that ability to accept to some degree that we might not have made that choice for ourselves, that somehow the choice has been made for us in this respect of this issue of coronavirus. And I think this is because it's such a global issue. It's not that the fact we can deny that there's a new reality for all of us. And it's quite extraordinary that it relates to so many of us all around the world. So that search for meaning, either of the crisis itself, what does that mean? And of the quarantine itself. I mean, a question around what does that mean in terms of what is having, living through this crisis is a big question. And I think for different people that feels more relevant and less relevant. But the meaning of the quarantine, it seems to be even more, it feels a little bit closer to us. And ability to make sense of this, of the pandemic, but also of the quarantine, seems to be a really important factor in how people are living through it and how people are able to move through this process, feeling like they've gained something, feeling like they're taking something from this experience that's meaningful to them, that is going to enhance their life moving forward. Search for meaning is a really big word combination, What does that mean? What is search for meaning? Meaning in life, meaning in relationships, meaning where and how? I think it's a very big, very lofty, a very lofty idea. But I want to focus on some moments, some points about it, in hopes that you are able to reflect on it and see whether some of this relates to you, because there's so much here to focus on and it's impossible to take it all in. But I think there's something about the isolation itself, as we already said, that brought up a lot of feelings and a lot of issues for people. When we're isolated, I don't know if any of you have experienced isolation before, either through sickness, either through meditation retreats. But when we're isolated one of the other, there aren't distractions anymore. There aren't things that we can easily distract ourselves with. And here comes the crust. We're either very uncomfortable by what's coming up, or we're intrigued by what's coming up, or all of them, or both at the same time. For those who are religious Jews who observe Shabbat, some people might relate to that, in terms of how confronting that can be sometimes when all of a sudden you're not doing a lot of things that you're doing during the week. And all of a sudden it is just you and your immediate surroundings, or there might be family and friends, but somehow there is less distraction and there's much more focus on yourself and your relationships on all different levels. And so what does that mean to be conscious of the isolation? How can we be conscious of what is happening for us? And I think that's a really, really serious question. And I think this is a question that if we're able to relate to it and really work with it and be with it, and maybe sometimes be uncomfortable. We don't like to be uncomfortable. We live in a culture where everything should feel good all the time. But unfortunately, I don't think that serves very well for psychological growth or being in more harmony with oneself and different aspects of ourself, including our spiritual life. So I think this is something I really think it's important when we think about this search for meaning and search for connection, because I think somehow search for meaning is also about search for connection with ourselves on a deeper level, connection with others, connection with our spiritual source, however people may understand that. So, and I think in that it's also that grief. And I remember one client had described this to me so poignantly, and I think this is a very, very important point. And she said to me, for a long time, I just felt I was stuck at home. I was stuck at home, and I just was at home. And before there were times, as she said, I was at home. It's not the first time that I spent time at home for various reasons. But when she realized that it's not that she's stuck at home and everyone else goes around their life as it was before, once she realized that this is a collective experience. It's not that she's at home because she chose to be at home for a week because of whatever those, choices were. She decided not to go out. And I think this is really something, this describes so well this reality of that sense of recognition of the new reality and the loss of the old situation, of the old, of the old situation, of old reality. And then she said, everything changed. Everything, the way I saw everything was different. And, she's had to then rearrange all kinds of expectations, all kinds of feelings, all kinds of ideas of what the next X number of months are going to look like. So, when we're going through this process, I think there are two things going on at this. It seems like at this point, and in our situation right now. So there's something individual, something going on for us individually in what we're having to face, something of ourselves through not having these distractions and through having having been placed limitations that have been placed on us in terms of movement, in terms of connections. And sometimes when that happens, we're able to see, or we're able to be in touch with a part of ourselves that maybe we don't like, maybe we don't want to see, we haven't been able to actualize. Perhaps it's some talents that we have that we have never been able to express. It could be any of those things. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's something really bad or something that we feel so terrible about ourselves. But it's sometimes, and that's just sometimes what we call in psychology shadow. Those parts of ourselves that's just kind of pushed out of our consciousness. It's just kind of on the side. There are people that I know that have felt through pain and through having to recognize those parts of ourselves, they have been able to connect much deeper to God, or much deeper to their own connection to that higher power in their life. So there's enormous potential through working with oneself. And this is what I mean when I say that out of even psychological work, something new can emerge. But I think we must work with those things. We must consciously engage with that psychological work, with that field of recognizing grief, in order for that to happen. I think also what's so unique about our current situation is the collective aspect of that, is that we're all somehow, somewhere, in some shape or form, dealing through this reality and perhaps going through that process, maybe more consciously, maybe less consciously, maybe more aware, maybe less aware, but somehow, somewhere, I think we all are in this very, in this kind of very deep process. And I think it's also I think it's a very deep psychological moment, but I also think it's a very deep spiritual moment in some ways for all of us to rise to our highest ability to see to ourselves, to see others, because if you don't see yourself, it's very hard to see others sometimes, to relate, to care for one another, to see somebody else's needs, be willing to sacrifice sometimes our own inconveniences for someone else. So I think this is what's so unique about this, the relationship to the emotional aspects of the pandemic is not only the difficulties, but what I feel are the really tremendous opportunities, if we can be conscious about it. Now, relationships is really a very basic fabric of our lives. I'm sure all of you would agree with that somehow. And of course, through the quarantine, through this pandemic, and quarantine as part of this pandemic, it seems like it has forced us really to look at our relationships. And I know I've already said something similar to that, but I wanted to really break it down, because I really think that for some people, it was very interesting for me to observe that for some people, this isolation forced them to look at their relationship with oneself. Especially that was very true for people who are single or elderly people, or not exclusively, but I think this situation is very glaring. People who are in partnership have found themselves, as some have said, discovering their partner sometimes for the first time in the way that I never saw them before, in all kinds of different ways. Some other people felt that they discovered their family in a different way, or they have seen aspects of family. Some of my friends have said they have discovered their children for the first time in the way that they didn't see them before. And some people felt that this was really a first time where they had an opportunity to really connect so deeply to themselves, to reach something very spiritual, to reach that relationship to the divinity within themselves and also to the divine outside of themselves. And for some people, it was all of the above. Hopefully, I think for most people, it is, it's not just one category, one, tick the box. It's all connected somehow. But I really wanted to break it down because I feel like in this isolation, in this quarantine, there's been enormous opportunity for creating relationships, and it sounds so bizarre. It's kind of almost paradoxical because we're isolated, we're not in relationship kind of physically, we weren't able to in the same way perhaps as before. And I know in different countries that looks differently, that has looked differently, but in principle we haven't been able to be, attend dinners or come to dinners or hang out and spend time together in the way that people have done before. But nevertheless, I feel like it's been an enormous opportunity for building relationships, or maybe in a much deeper way than before. So I think it's also raised all these questions about how do we relate, with whom, and how, which relationships have been also destruction in many ways, on which relationships actually give us a lot. And I think that, again, I think this is really important, this very important differentiation between those what relationship serves for us, for people who haven't been able to travel, all of a sudden, only for me, not being able to see my family who lives abroad, all of a sudden became much more acute than I ever experienced before, because my whole life was predicated on understanding I could just hop on a plane and be somewhere as long as I could afford it. All of a sudden, that's not the case anymore, And also, in some ways, leaning into this situation and realizing, or being reminded, actually, for me personally, is that we're not in control nearly as much as we would like to be. And sometimes, even though I know that, being reminded of that in such a concrete and confronting way was something difficult to face. So what can we do to help? Because it is all, I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, this is all very nice and hopefully interesting, but what can we do to help with this process? Because if you're recognizing yourself or you're recognizing other people in that, perhaps you're thinking about what can be helpful. So I want to share with you some of the things that I have found helpful in my work with my clients, also with my own experience. And I really want to underline the first one, which is to acknowledge feelings of grief or any other feelings that come up. And I know that sounds very simple. I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, that's pretty obvious. And it's not all that difficult. But I will challenge you a little bit about that. Because actually, I think sometimes we can say it as an intellectual concept. Oh, the wonderful thing about the world of self-help and all the access to information that we have nowadays is that while we're maybe more educated about some of our emotional life, sometimes we can use that as a way of distracting or moving ourselves from an emotional life. I know I could be feeling this, or I know I should be feeling this, or I might be feeling this, but actually I don't need to be feeling this, or and so on and so forth. So it sometimes kind of serves as a kind of a explanation. But when we relate our emotions in this kind of explanatory cognitive way, we don't actually let ourselves to really feel the feeling. And that's the whole crust of the matter. It's not just to say it as if it's happening to somebody else. It's to name it and to feel it. When you're giving somebody a hug, you can give somebody a hug that's kind of what I call a virtual hug. It's not a virtual hug, but it's not really a close hug. Or you can really give somebody a hug. And it's very different. It feels different. You can feel somebody's arms around you, or you can feel somebody in some kind of vicinity next to you. Yeah. So I think there's something very powerful and very important of naming it, naming feelings and feeling them. And I know that often we're fearful because we think if we feel anything, it's all going to just overwhelm us. But for majority of cases, that's actually not true. It's a fear, but it's not necessarily true. I know there are cases where there are situations I will acknowledge that can be real. That can be the reality, but I think that's often more fear than the reality for majority of people. And you see, feelings need to be acknowledged. You know, those of you who have children or have worked with children or have some kind of relationship with children, you know the power of how a child responds when you acknowledge them, when you acknowledge how they feel, when you acknowledge their being, then rather than when you skirt away from that, or you find a way to explain their behavior, or you're trying a way of moving away from it. You know that they will follow you and they will continue at it until you see that they're seen. And I think feelings very much speak to that also. Um, Also, I think what's really important in our situation is to try to recognize anticipatory grief. And what do I mean by anticipatory grief? It's a grief that hasn't happened yet. It's our fear of what might happen. It's knowing that now we know there are numbers of people who have died. So we know statistically, and I would be very surprised that if some of you haven't thought about the fact, well, how old am I? How statistically likely that I will get sick? How statistically likely that somebody else that I know might get sick? How statistically likely that my parents might be ill? You know, which is completely understandable. I would be very hard for me to believe for those of us here who have elderly parents haven't thought about, oh my God, what would happen if they become ill? You know, which is completely understandable, except that it doesn't really help us. Yeah, there's nothing, we can't. We can talk to our parents about what steps they might take to protect themselves, but we have no idea whether they will become ill or not. And it's very hard sometimes to try to bring that into some kind of balance, to remind ourselves that yes, the likelihood of significant consequences of somebody who is elderly who becomes ill than somebody who is, I don't know, 30 years old becoming ill are different. But not all elderly become ill, for example, and not all elderly die. Is to try to kind of bring some, and that's one of the approaches, not only the only one, but to bring some objective reality to that anxiety, is to try to soothe that anxiety by also acknowledging that these feelings are real, that anxiety is real, but also recognizing that this is anxiety, you know, which is very understandable in this very unstable, unknown, diffuse situation, but also I think recognizing for what it is and how you might then go about dealing with it might be very useful in kind of soothing it and bringing it to some kind of balance. It's not to say that we won't feel anything. I don't think it's possible, but that at least we can name it and we can give it some kind of form and shape. Yeah. I think what also can be helpful, and sometimes it's very difficult, and I will be the first one to put my hand up, is to say that was very difficult for me personally, is to let go of what you can't control. Can't let go of your elderly parents, don't want to take precautions. You can't control what your neighbors are going to do. Can't even control what your government is going to do, really, most of the time. But you can control what steps you're going to take. You can control what steps you're going to take. You can control how you're going to take care of yourself. You can control everything that we just discussed up to now in terms of your own emotional life. Yeah. When I work with clients, I really try, and especially at this time, I mean, that's also true but this isn't the case. Excuse me. But when I work with clients, particularly now, I really try to help them to connect to those feelings, their feelings, both verbally, but also with attention to the nonverbal, their nonverbal expressions and kind of body awareness. Not only because all of these things are helpful, but because it gives people a sense of control. It gives people a sense, I can recognize my feelings. I can pay attention to my body. I can notice when things are happening in my body, and I can do something about that. So it kind of has a double positive effect, potentially. Yeah. If any of these doesn't totally make sense to you, we can discuss them afterwards if you have any questions. But I just want to kind of go through some of the things that I found very helpful in my experience, but also with others around me. To try to accept changes that are happening around us with minimal judgment. And what does that really mean? It's, I think, very much linked to this sense of the recognition of not having control and leaning into a situation. in a sense that yes, we can become very upset. Yes, we can become very agitated sometimes. We can have a lot of emotional responses to different things. But if they're not things we can control and they're not things that we can affect, sometimes it can be more distressing than helpful. Yeah. So we're living in a situation that there's so much that's out of our control, and there's so much that um, we can have an emotional response about. There's so much and it's very hard sometimes, I think, for us to take this kind of non-judgmental attitude. And I'm not saying that it's always going to be the case, and I'm not saying that's even possible to do 100% of the time. But the more that we can observe something without having a judgment about it, especially, as I said, if there are things that we can't control, then it seems to be that people live through this at this time with more emotional integrity and more feeling of wholeness. Patience, I think, is also another one that's can be very helpful, although can be hard to find sometimes within ourselves, because again, I think it ties into not having a sense of control, and sometimes being patient can be very difficult when we can't do anything about it. We don't have, there's so much information that becomes available from, as we move along from this situation. We realize that people that we always that we always relied on having all the information, like sometimes doctors and so experts and this and that, and we're realizing now sometimes they don't have actually all the information. We don't have all the information, you know. And trying to be patient with the situation, but also being patient with ourselves, soothing ourselves, reminding ourselves that this is a difficult situation. This is a situation that there's a lot of unknowns, that challenges us, I think, in a really fundamental way. And trying to find that place of, patience for ourselves. Now, connecting to others is, I think, something I found to have been almost universally helpful. Again, connecting to others in a way that's meaningful. I don't mean it in a way of, just doing something to try to move away from what you're feeling, but to connect to others, to some of the friendships or some of the relationships or family relationships or partnerships that you're in a way that's in listening to yourself. And I think this kind of feeds into the next point that I have on my slide is the listening to your own voice, listening to yourself and hearing, what are relationships that you feel drawn towards? What are the relationships that are going to be of resource to you? What are the relationships where you can give to someone that will be meaningful to you? So as a personal example, it's been very meaningful for me to give some of my time as a therapist during this time to volunteer. And, and in one of the volunteer projects that I was involved in, it was really incredible to sort of see how elderly who have been through the Shoah, who have been through the Holocaust, who have been through the war, how they respond to this situation, how they experience our current debacle, So for me, it was incredibly resourceful to do that. For somebody else, it's something else. I'm not saying it's universal, but I want to highlight is that, listening to oneself and connecting in a meaningful way at this time can be very useful and can be very meaningful and can be very giving and nurturing for ourselves. And the last and not least is I wanted to briefly talk us through the concepts of mindfulness and meditation that I think can be very, very helpful also, and as we're moving through this very complex situation. And actually, there's a lot of people talk about mindfulness and meditation. There's a lot that's written, and you can find loads of information on the internet. So I really just wanted to touch on it in the most basic way. I don't know what familiarity you have, all of you have with mindfulness and meditation, and actually, they are very simple things. They're not simple in terms of kind of living it and doing it, but not always. But they're not actually very complicated if we start with the most basic problem and the most basic ideas. And mindfulness is all simply is a non-judgmental observation. It's what I was referring to a little bit earlier about not having judgment or trying not to have judgment. It's just an ability of the mind to observe without criticism. Observe, as in I'm in front of this computer right now. I'm seeing my computer, I'm seeing my slides. I know there are people listening to me. That's an observation. That's a statement of what's happening. Yeah? My feelings about it or my reactions to it, that's something else. Yes? But there's a difference between that and observation. That's just simple observation. So with this ability, one can see things without condemnation and judgment. Yeah, it's because it's just is. You're not surprised by it. You're just observing it. Yeah. Sometimes it can be as simple as I'm sitting on the couch. I see there's a chair. I don't know, a bookshelf, armchair, and a TV. Yeah. It's just an observation. You're just taking a basic balanced interest in things around you as they are. Yeah. Meditation, mindfulness can be practiced almost all the time. You can be mindful when we're eating. You can be mindful when you are walking. You can be mindful when you are talking to playing with your child. It can be practiced almost all the time, but it is something that requires practice. The helpful thing about it is that it can be applied all the time as well. But I want to use it particularly in the context of meditation. And I'm also using the most easiest, the most simplest breath meditation that I think most people don't have any objection to in terms of a theoretical kind of concept. And what you're doing in a breath meditation is that you notice, you make yourself comfortable, and then you notice the breath as the air comes into your nose, or in how it leaves your body. As you feel your stomach fall. Yeah? So sometimes sometimes at the beginning, people use a candle just so that it helps them to focus on something, because focusing on breath can be difficult. But it allows us an opportunity to practice this non-judgmental attitude. So when your mind wanders, then you just bring it back. You can use an image of a river that flows, just the flow of the river, and your thoughts that come up, or wherever your mind wanders, you just let those thoughts down the river, down the lake, down the sea, whatever you want. It doesn't matter, But the idea is that as your thoughts come in, as you are thinking about what you did do that day, didn't do that day, what your partner said, what your friend had said or didn't say, or the fight you had, you just kind of gently let it out. Just let it go. So, and it involves really awareness of the breath without changing it. It's just being aware. Just being aware. And this is where I think mindfulness come in, because I think without thinking about mindfulness and this kind of observing and non-judgmental attitude, sometimes meditation can feel very difficult for people, because what often people tell me is that, well, I've tried it, but I had so many thoughts and I had so many reactions to when I tried to focus on my breath that I was so overwhelmed I just couldn't do it. Yeah. So to think about the breath and think about your just focusing on your breath. It's just focusing on something very simple. Breath is fundamental to our being. Yeah. There's no breath, we don't live. I mean, it's interesting because it's so basic, it's so fundamental, and yet it's so difficult to focus on that. So and it seems very deceivingly easy, I think. And at the same time, it's not, once you get into a habit of doing it, it's the value, I think, of meditation. And I've been meditating for over 20 years now. And the value of 15 minutes of meditation a day, I don't think I can begin to tell you how helpful I have found it. And there's a lot of sort of, if you want to look at it from point of view research, you can look it up. There's a lot of research around, helpfulness in meditation. But what it gives an opportunity is to connect to yourself, is to begin to really hear yourself. And it will not always be like this. There will be days you will try to meditate and it doesn't work. And there'll be days you just like, what was that? What did I just do for the last 20 minutes, And the other times, but there will be times with practice, you will begin to hear your inner voice. you will begin to hear, you begin to connect to yourself. You'll begin to feel calmer. You'll feel grounded. You'll begin to feel connected. Because once you feel more connected to yourself, you'll always feel more connected to others. And in this opportunity to practice, then being present, being connected, having some distance from your own emotional reactions, in terms of noticing, when you get to a point where you can feel that you're noticing you're having a reaction, but you don't have to act on it. It's like you're observing yourself. I'm having a feeling. Oh, right. I'm feeling something. I'm noticing something, but you don't necessarily have to act on it. So I can't underscore the value of this combined kind of mindfulness and meditation approach. And it's a little bit different to visualization. Sometimes people call visualization meditation, and it's not quite the same thing. It's also useful, but not the same. Let's say you're visualizing a tree, or you're visualizing yourself as a tree or as a mountain where, you have strong roots and strong branches, and you can connect to that energy, and it's also can be helpful, but it's different. What meditation allows you, breath meditation allows you, is a connection to yourself, connection to your own depth, connection to your own emotions, connections to what's important to you. And once you have that, and once you're able to connect on that level to yourself, then everything transforms around you. Your relationships with others become become fuller and become more whole. This I cannot stress enough, and it's the only thing that's for me and my for psychotherapy practice, and also in my personal work on myself. This has been a really important part of that, and I know that a lot of my clients have really benefited from doing that, and even doing as simple as 15 minutes of breath meditation. But when you do it every day, it accumulates. It accumulates sooner than you might think. So slowly coming to the end of my talking part. So just wanted to say that thank you for listening thank you for paying attention, thank you for listening. I want to for those of you who are sorry, seems to take some time when I go to the next slide. So for those of you who are here, who are interested in things that we're talking about, if you would like to, I'm very happy to offer a 30-minute free consultation for anybody who is interested. You just need to make sure it's scheduled within a week of us this week, or which can be done either you can leave me your name and email in the chat box, or you can contact me as long as it's within this week. This is the end of what I want to talk to you about. I'm going to stop share and stop recording in particular, because I want to be able to now stop recording. 1 second.